CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Money in the bank. Two European financial giants surprised the markets with their best earnings in more than a decade.
Our other headlines is the Black Sea grain deal heading for collapse. We're in Moscow to assess if it might be saved.
BP is facing a shareholder revolt at its annual meeting in London for rolling back emission targets.
The only human beings inside this car are just me and my cameraman.
And a taxi without all the small talk. We test out one of Beijing's robo-taxis to experience true driverless technology.
Upbeat earnings have driven European shares higher as some of the continent's largest lenders look to be in robust shape. London-based Barclays beat analyst expectations, reporting a net profit of $2.2 billion in the first quarter, up 27%. It marks the bank's highest quarterly profit in 12 years. Meanwhile, Germany's biggest lender, Deutsche Bank, has reported a net profit of $1.3 billion, its 11th straight quarter of profit. But it also says that 800 jobs will be axed as part of a new cost-saving drive. Well, let's talk to independent banking analyst Francis Coppola. Good to see you again, Francis. Let's talk big picture first. Not long ago, we were talking about a global banking crisis. We've had these good results from the European banks, Deutsche Bank and Barclays. So is this banking crisis over?
Well, I never thought it was going to be a global banking crisis. I always thought it was an American crisis, particularly a crisis of American mid-tier banks. And one big bank in Europe, which had been experiencing problems for really quite some time. The bank run on Credit Suisse started back last October, and it really just got caught in the crossfire from the failure of Silicon Valley Bank. So I think it was more specific areas of the banking market rather than the whole of global banking. So this rather confirms my view that in general, the position for big banks, at any rate, is actually rather healthy. They've got rising interest rates, and banks generally tend to do quite well with rising interest rates, and that's really what's happened with both these banks.
Well, let's look at these two banks in particular then. They actually beat expectations, so what did they do well?
Well, they've been lending a lot and making quite a lot of money from their net interest income. Different lending portfolios. Barclays' results have been dominated by their cards business, interestingly, in the United States, where they're very strong. And Deutsche Bank, it's been more corporate lending, but it's still a very strong lending profile. And they've generated quite a lot of interest income on the back of that.
So that's the good news. There was some less positive news for both banks, particularly for their investment banking divisions. What went on there?
Yeah, well, both banks have suffered a bit of a retrenchment in investment banking. It's fair to say the conditions are quite difficult for investment banking generally at the moment. You know, we're in an age of very high uncertainty, and you know, there's corporate debt issuance is down, and there's not so much advisory work, there's not so much M&A, and so it's harder for for investment banks to make any headway at the moment. That said, Deutsche Bank, at any rate, did you rather well on fixed income, so there are bright spots out there.
They did announce a cost-saving programme, though, along with some job cuts. Does that suggest there might be a slightly bumpy road ahead?
Yes, I took both banks as having some headwinds. In a way, the strong performance in lending is a reflection of where we are, particularly Barclays with cards and so forth, is a reflection of where we are in the business cycle at the moment, that people are increasing their borrowing in a way because they've got inflationary pressures eating into their real incomes, and they're borrowing to compensate for that. Now, that's something that can't continue. So I'm expecting two things. First of all, the increase in lending will slow down. And the second thing is that bad loans will start to rise. Indeed, we did see Barclays provisioning more against bad loans already.
Francis, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Francis Coppola, the independent banking analyst.
Well, investor concerns over the health of the United States banking sector have calmed slightly as First Republic Bank recovered moderately in pre-market trading after hitting a record low on Wednesday. Lots of caveats in this. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. John, First Republic, how's it hanging on?
Yes, well, Robin and Jamie, I like what Francis Coppola said there. I thought that was terrific, because there isn't a global banking crisis, it turns out, but there is one here in America with these regional banks. And you don't have regional banks in many parts of the world. It's something that we have in America. It's peculiar to this country. And I tell you, people love their regional banks, but they may have to forego them in the future if this doesn't get sorted out. So we had SVB and Silvergate go over back around the 9th or 10th of March. And the next one in trouble, First Republic, and it still is in trouble. But you're right, it is hanging on by a thread, but it is hanging on. The funny thing is First Republic has a similar structure to the other two as well, although First Republic really concentrated on, or concentrates because it's still going, on wealthy clients. The problem is they're running out of options, really. So these are the options on the table. And again, in this economic climate that we find ourselves in, everybody you ask here will give you a different answer. One very famous trader yesterday said that he thought it would be taken over by the authorities in the form of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and that the issue would be, would the authorities guarantee the deposits of people who hold more than $250,000? Somebody else yesterday afternoon said, no, I think there's going to be a fire sale, and somebody will buy this bank for just cents on the dollar. So this seems to be the best option today. Somebody will buy it for not really very much money. There'll be some kind of takeover. And I have to say that this bank, First Republic, has operated under the auspices of both Merrill Lynch and Bank of America before, so it wouldn't be unheard of. But 2 days ago, their shares were down 50%. Last night, they were down another 30%. And it is true that they are up 10% at the moment. But I just think that there's a sense that there's another shoe to drop yet, that we're not quite out of the woods. And the most interesting stock to everybody here this morning is what's happening with First Republic Bank.
Now, a regular seasonal subject, the United States debt ceiling, but there's been some movement on the debt ceiling.
Yes. Yes, but, God, this country really, honestly, I mean, the thing is, I don't know whether our viewers understand, but America is about the only country in the world where the politicians must vote to increase the debt ceiling. And America is, I mean, I think there might be one other, or maybe they've given up the idea now, but we haven't here. What happened last night was the Republicans, who control the House, squeezed through a bill that they would be very happy with in order to raise the debt ceiling, They got it through with just 2 votes. Now it has to go to the Senate, and the people that run the Senate have already said this bill is DOA, which means dead on arrival. In other words, there's just no support in the democratically controlled Senate for this bill. Now, the problem with this is that the money's gone. It's already left the Treasury. It's been spent. It was approved by Congress. And so there's always a battle here between the presidency that says, look, Congress, you spent the money, so you raise the debt ceiling, and the Congress, which pushes back at the White House and says, no, Mr. President, you change your policies, and then we'll think about it. That's really what's going on. We will run out of money sometime here between July and September. Nobody knows when. The Treasury is already doing special measures to make sure we don't run out of money sooner. Basically, if the debt ceiling isn't raised, America can't pay its bills, and America will default on its debts. And that's never happened. And people don't think it'll happen this time either. But in a television democracy, they're going to milk it for everything they possibly can to get every little ounce of political capital out of it that both sides possibly can.
John, GDP figures have just been published. It's a bit of a mixed picture, isn't it?
Yes. Well, I think so. I mean, it's very difficult to say. I mean, we're just in this environment where really nobody knows truly what's going on. Look, we've been told to expect GDP in the first quarter. That's growth. Everything that happens in America, that's public companies who are based here, that's public companies that are owned by overseas people, government contracts, education, everything goes into the pot, give it a big stir. And today we were told to expect 1.9% growth in the first quarter. It turned out to be 1.1%. And this doesn't mean the US is facing a recession imminently, necessarily, although that's the big concern, of course. Personal consumption was up 1% over last month. We had MasterCard today saying that the consumer is still very resilient. There were big cuts in business spending, however. And the other side of this whole equation is the jobless numbers, which are very, very strong. Despite all the tech layoffs, the number of people signing up for first-time employment benefit last Saturday was at 230,000. It had been 245,000 the week before. So you would have expected it to go up, but it went down. So it's all very confusing. On top of that, the earnings are coming in. The tech companies are doing the business. Meta had its first sales increase in a year yesterday. Microsoft and Alphabet, pretty much the same thing. We're expecting the same from Amazon when they report in about 4 hours' time. So it's all pointing towards a small 25 basis point increase next week when the Fed meets. And today the Dow Jones was up sharply before this GDP news came out, and it still is.
John, good to see you. Thanks for that. Our correspondent John Terrace in New York.
Inflation, a tech downturn and a banking crisis have resulted in a turbulent start to the year for the United States economy.
And that's led to massive layoffs around the world as businesses cut costs. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
So far this year, tech companies have laid off roughly 170,000 people around the world.
So the layoffs were tied, one, to the overstaffing, and two, to the impact of inflation and higher prices, which is causing less demand for PCs and consumer devices and even telecom devices.
Amazon recently announced it will be laying off 9,000 employees, while Meta will cut 10,000. During their first wave of cuts, Meta did not extend the contract of IT technician Daniel Gonzalez. Now he's a contract worker at First Republic Bank, an institution also under financial pressure.
It's following me, unfortunately, but like I said, try to do my best, just hope for the best, but plan for the worst.
Small and mid-sized banks like First Republic are fighting for survival in the wake of the collapse in March of Silicon Valley Bank, a bank well known for having venture capitalists and startups as investors. As the value of the bank's investments drastically decreased and customers began withdrawing large amounts, the federal government stepped in as a backstop. And within the month, First Citizens Bank agreed to buy the troubled operation.
What happened here with Silicon Valley Bank showed a crack in the banking system in the U.S. And that really has changed the dynamics of one, the smaller banks and whether they can potentially even survive, and two, how the U.S. government has to look at this going forward.
Despite the turbulent economy, Lang Chen, a risk management consultant for one of the U.S.'s largest banks, isn't worried.
I don't think the big banks has big impact so far, but then for the smaller banks, I'm not sure because I don't bank with them. But I just hope everything would be all right, and then the bank can survive, so the whole economy can still keep going.
But U.S. bank Goldman Sachs recently cut more than 3,000 jobs, and in Europe, Credit Suisse collapsed in March, with rival UBS sweeping in to take over.
Just tell me your thoughts about the way the economy is going right now.
Well, down the pan. It's not great.
I was laid off in November. I was feeling burnout already.
Layoffs combined with remote work policies have impacted downtown areas. In San Francisco, this side of the walkway used to be filled with restaurants, but now there's just one left, Sushi Quinta.
Working in the day is the 2 times a week. So maybe the Tuesday, Wednesday something. So that's why the business is a little bit tough, and this one up and down, up and down.
Despite all the layoffs, there are signs of hope. The latest U.S. jobs report shows the U.S. economy added 236,000 jobs in March, with the leisure and hospitality sectors showing the biggest gains. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
Fashion retailer Gap is laying off about 1,800 employees. The Banana Republic parent company had already cut 500 corporate jobs in September. Last month, Gap posted a bigger than expected fourth quarter loss as demand for its clothing weakened.
Argentina says it'll pay for imports from China in the Chinese renminbi rather than the US dollar. It buys around $1 billion worth of goods from China each month. The economy minister says the move can help tackle the country's dwindling dollar reserves. Argentina is the latest country to ditch dollars in trade with China, following Brazil and some countries in Southeast Asia.
Tens of thousands of teachers have walked out of schools in England asking the government to meet their pay demands. It's their fourth strike this year. The government's already offered a one-off payment of $1,250 and a 4.3% pay rise next year. That's been rejected as not matching inflation. Unions are planning another strike on Tuesday.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the race to escape Sudan. Fighting continues as an uneasy ceasefire between the two warring factions can't stand to its final hours.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Efforts by the African Union and the United States to extend the ceasefire between the two warring sides in Sudan continue. The 72-hour truce is due to expire at midnight local time.
The pause in fighting allowed tens of thousands of Sudanese to escape the capital, Khartoum, and international governments to evacuate some of their nationals from the country. But many foreign nationals remain. Gunfire has been heard in the capital, and reports suggest fighting over the last 3 days has intensified in West Darfur. The violence that began 12 days ago has worsened the humanitarian situation with widespread water and power shortages.
Well, our correspondent Adel El-Marouki is on the border between Egypt and Sudan. So, Adel, what are you seeing where you are?
Well, the traffic at the border is starting to slow down as we approach end of the day. There is about a dozen buses remaining waiting for passengers to get out of the border, though it is working 24/7. But it is seemingly getting a bit calm. There's tons of goods waiting at the border to get the green light to enter into Sudan, as thousands have been coming into Egypt. According to the Egyptian Foreign Ministry, at least 16,000 foreigners have entered Egypt, and about 2,700 Egyptians came into the country. That's from 10,000 Egyptians in Sudan, half of which are students at high school and universities. And there's still procedures ongoing with directives from the Egyptian president and the Egyptian government at the Border Control Authority to facilitate and ease the processing time for those stranded on the Sudanese side.
So people fleeing Sudan into neighbouring countries like Chad, South Sudan, Egypt, how are these countries coping with this influx of refugees?
Well, no one was ready for this number of people coming into the border. These are usually very calm border because cities from the Egyptian side, from the Sudanese side, and also Chad and South Sudan, cities are quite far from the border. We're talking about hundreds of kilometers away. So this is not a usual route for passengers, tourists, or visitors to cross the border. Usually it is by flight, and this is where the most traffic is. But because of the current fighting and the no-flight zone over Sudan, people only choice to cross the border is through the land crossing. So there is a pressure and a surge of people on an infrastructure that is not ready to accommodate these tens of thousands crossing in all directions of Sudan. So there's a shortage of services, food and water, sewers, and all the basic infrastructure facilities have been consumed and under huge pressure as the numbers are only increasing since the fighting began on April 15.
Adel, thank you very much. That's our correspondent Adel El-Marouki on the border between Egypt and Sudan.
Well, let's talk now to Kwaku Noama, who's senior lecturer and chair for the International Peace and Conflict Resolution Programme with the American University. He joins us from Washington. Kwaku, welcome. Sudan's army has expressed willingness to extend the ceasefire for a further 72 hours. Can we take that at face value? Would it be reciprocated, do you think?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it's a question of whether General Hameti thinks that this ceasefire helps him. You realize that the ceasefire was negotiated by the Americans, mostly held, but there were still some attacks. And I think that as the government gains the upper hand, it is more likely to entertain some type of negotiation to secure a deal that helps it. For Hameti, he's trying to see if he can get situations on the ground to favor him before he agrees to a ceasefire. So we are hopeful. We hope that the IGAD leaders who are pushing can get him to commit so we can have some relief on the ground for the people.
Look, while we count down the hours to the end of the current ceasefire, let's start counting the days and the weeks and look ahead slightly more medium term. In your judgment, what's going to happen next for Sudan?
Well, I think that the government has committed itself publicly to at least agreeing to an extension of the ceasefire. The danger is that if the government gets to a point where it thinks that it can win outright, it may not be interested in a ceasefire anymore. I think the African leaders are going to keep pushing both sides to come to the table. I don't see an agreement today, but maybe by tomorrow, depending on the structural conditions, you may see more pressure coming from other parties who have an interest in that conflict, including the United States and Egypt, and even the Saudis may get involved pushing the IGAD proposal, and that might do the job.
I don't know if you managed to hear our correspondent on the border of Sudan with Egypt, with the buses lined up. I mean, it's clear the fighting between the two groups is having a knock-on effect in the region. Of course it would. We know violence is flaring up again in Darfur. I mean, this obviously will spiral, won't it, with much more profound, wider consequences.
As we expect it to. The region is turbulent. You have Sudan's 7 neighbors all have some problems with security, with internal problems, and you're going to see refugees flooding into these places. This is why we need a regional approach to this problem. This is something that can spiral quickly into a regional war. We've already seen a lot of stress on neighboring states like Chad. Central African Republic is very fragile. South Sudan itself is very fragile. Then you have Libya, of course. And so hopefully we can all get a deal. Parties can realize that there is no military solution to this problem, at least in the short term, so that you can have some kind of arrangement that allows humanitarian agencies to move back in. And also there needs to be support for the countries that are receiving displaced persons so that when they go to these places, they don't add to the stress in the host countries.
Kwaku, come back and talk to us again soon. For the moment, thank you very much for being on the program. Kwaku Noama from the American University in Washington.
The First group of Chinese evacuees from Sudan have arrived in the Saudi Arabian city of Jeddah. They include 668 Chinese citizens.
China's Navy has mobilized 2 warships from the Gulf of Aden to carry out the operation. An Air China flight is scheduled to fly to Saudi Arabia on Friday to take them to Beijing. So far, China has relocated more than 1,300 people to safety.
Russia won't get away with this. That's the warning from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky after the city of Mykolaiv was targeted with a missile strike.
At least 1 person has been killed and dozens of others injured, including a child. A house, apartment block and an historical building were damaged. Moscow has denied deliberately targeting civilians during its military campaign.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent Shelby Wilder in Kyiv. So, Shelby, what's the latest on the fighting?
Well, following that strike overnight on the Ukrainian city of Mykolaiv by Russian missiles, we also learned that late yesterday a Ukrainian journalist was killed outside the city of Kherson in the southeast of Ukraine. His Italian colleague, also a journalist, was reported injured when apparently Russian snipers opened fire on them from across the Dnipro River. Now, both of these men had covered the conflict extensively, and it is believed that both of those journalists were wearing helmets and bulletproof vests that clearly said press on them at the time, which has called here for reports of investigations relating to war crimes, with this journalist being killed, the first journalist to be killed in Ukraine this year. Other news relating to Ukraine and fighting. We heard today from NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg in Brussels saying that NATO allies and partners had almost delivered all of the promised combat vehicles to Ukraine. This included over 1,500 armored vehicles, 230 tanks, and large quantities of ammunition. Jens Stoltenberg said that this would put Ukraine in a stronger position to try and take back territory from Russia as Ukraine launches its highly anticipated spring counteroffensive.
And Shelby, we've talked a lot in recent weeks about the battle for Bakhmut. What's the latest on that?
So the latest we are hearing from Ukrainian intelligence is that Russia's military has switched to defensive positions along the front lines. That's everywhere apart from this besieged city of Bakhmut and its immediate surrounding areas in the Donetsk region. And Ukrainian military officials have said that Bakhmut in particular is just getting pummeled by Russian forces. Within the last 24 hours alone, Russia's military has attacked Bakhmut at least 324 times. That's with airstrikes and also other weapons such as rocket launchers. And Ukraine's military has said that they believe Russia's military is trying to destroy buildings in and around Bakhmut so that that infrastructure cannot be used as fortifications by Ukrainian forces. Ukraine's military says that this is, quote, Syrian tactics, end quote, saying that they believe Russia is trying to destroy everything in and around that highly contested city. As we know, Ukrainian forces have been holding on to the western edge of Bakhmut, which is located in the Donetsk region. Otherwise, that is the latest on the fighting and news from Ukraine with me here on the ground in Kyiv.
Shelby, thank you very much. Our correspondent Shelby Wilder in Kyiv.
Well, Russia has warned that the only way to save the Black Sea grain deal is full implementation.
The deal, brokered by the United Nations and Turkey last year, allows Ukrainian grain trapped by the conflict to be safely exported from the country's ports.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, lots of developing countries rely on Ukraine's grain for vital food supplies. Is this Black Sea grain deal heading for collapse?
That's the way it seems to be going so far, with people talking here in Russia, including the president's office, about many unfulfilled obligations as part of that deal, meaning Russia doesn't believe it's getting a fair deal. The problems for Russia are many. Some of them are that, for example, its fertilizer exports cannot make it through a pipeline to Ukraine for export via the Black Sea, due to Ukraine closing that down. It also has issues with financing its exports, saying that due to Western Western sanctions imposed after the so-called special military operation. Russian exporters are having problems getting payments. All of that, Russia says, must be resolved for this deal to be renewed. But as recently as today, on Thursday, the Russian Foreign Ministry says so far progress has been unsatisfactory. Now, there has been an intervention by the United Nations Secretary General, who, when speaking with the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, at the United Nations in New York, presented a package of potential solutions, some proposals that might see these issues being cleared up before mid-May, but the Foreign Ministry says these are still being looked into. Meanwhile, there's pessimism about the prospect of even those proposals making a difference within the month we have now for that deal to be renewed.
Any reaction from the Kremlin following the phone call between the presidents of China and Ukraine?
Well, it's been cautious, the Kremlin. It says that this is ultimately a sovereign matter for China and Ukraine, but it says it does welcome any effort that seeks to try and create some kind of peace with the Ukraine conflict. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, said that this was an important matter to try and make progress on, but it could not be at the expense of any of the goals of the Russian side, that the goals of the so-called special military operation would still need to be fulfilled. The Russian Foreign Ministry echoed those comments, but also said it believed the problem with a lack of progress on negotiations was firmly at the feet of Kiev, saying they are blocking any diplomatic talk or any progress in that respect. So far, Ukraine says that it would need to see action from Russia, but Russia has indicated again on Thursday that it's not willing to take any action that might undermine its ultimate objectives.
Stuart, thank you for that. Our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN's Storyboard email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, we're on the road to test out one of Beijing's robo-taxis and experience true driverless technology.
Roger, reading loud and clear.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we're trying to save the world.
Oh,
we hope it will happen. We have to live in hope.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. Moscow warns the only way to save the Black Sea grain deal, allowing the safe export of Ukrainian grain, is by including Russian fertilizer as part of the implementation.
Our other headlines, two European financial giants surprised the markets with their best earnings in more than a decade.
BP's annual meeting in London has been disrupted by climate protesters and a shareholder revolt.
Some of the UK's biggest pension funds are angry over the energy giant's move to roll back its targets for reducing emissions. The chairman, Helge Lund, told investors that BP will push ahead with its green energy transition, but not in a forced way. Shareholders brought forward a resolution to try and force the oil giant to align its targets with the Paris Climate Accord and commit to total carbon emission cuts by the year 2030.
Well, Christophe Roule is a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Centre on Global Energy Policy. He was also a former chief economist for BP. Welcome, Christophe. So BP has watered down its climate goals, making plenty of shareholders angry, as well as pension funds that invest in BP. They brought forward a resolution to change all that, but will that anger make any difference to BP?
Well, it's always difficult to serve two masters, and I think there's probably a majority of shareholders quite happy with adjusting the pace of this transition. And there's a very vocal, but still a very, I think, strong minority of shareholders very unhappy with that slowdown. And the pension funds you mentioned are part of that. According to the numbers I've seen, they own about 0.5%, so half a percentage of PP shares. So we can say that the noise and the importance is not necessarily in line. But the bigger question, of course, in the background is, why is BP doing this? And I think it is probably a sensible thing to do. They do it because they recognize that the energy transition cannot proceed as fast as people have thought, and is not as easy as people have thought. And that just has to be taken into account. And part of the problem is that for many years to come, it will require oil and gas. And if Western big producers like BP back way too fast from this, it will still be produced just in other parts of the world by other players. The question is whether that is more sensible, or it's more sensible to adjust the pace. I think maybe more sensible to adjust the pace.
Well, as you say, some shareholders perhaps happy with the adjustment of the pace of this clean energy transition, because this all comes amid BP's record profits, doesn't it? And shareholders perhaps would be quite keen to see record profits.
Exactly. So there you have the other part. So to speak, the silent majority of shareholders must still be people who invested consciously in an oil and gas company and want to see oil and gas being produced, in particular if that happens in years of very high prices and then short profits are very high as well. And don't forget, though, that oil and gas production is a long-term business, and you have to look through the cycle. You have some years with stellar profits and enormous cash flows and share buybacks and all of that, and then you have some other years with not much funding where you have to borrow to keep your investment going. So there are both sides to that. One shouldn't get too overly excited, but it remains true that one of the things the energy crisis and the war in the Ukraine have taught us is that fossil fuels are still needed, and in times of a crisis, of security problems, they're needed even more when the prices shoot up. And those investors who have consciously invested, some of them years or decades ago, in an oil and gas company, of course, will be very happy about that, and probably some of them reluctant to change to more modern times and to scale down the oil and gas business, as BP has promised to do.
Christophe, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us. That's Christophe Roux from Columbia University.
Always a pleasure.
The French car company Citroën is expanding in Asia and Latin America. I've been talking to Thierry Coscas, the CEO, on his plans for the company's new cars and the road ahead for the global car market.
We are launching today a mid-size SUV in India and in Latin America. It's the all-new C3 Across. This is at the heart of the market, both in India and in Latin America.
Why is Asia and South America so important? Why are they such important growth markets for Citroën?
We are very much a European-centered brand, but obviously we want to grow outside of Europe. The two pillars that we have is South America, where the presence of the brand is quite old already, but we have a lot of growth opportunity. And India, where we established the brand 4 years ago, with a bold strategy with one model every year, starting last year. This is the second one. And India is a very promising market. Probably it will soon reach 5 million units sold. And this is a great opportunity.
And what about China? What are Citroën's plans for China?
Well, at the moment, as you know, we have a joint venture with a Chinese company. We are successfully manufacturing and selling cars in China, particularly the C5X. And the objective is obviously to continue the sales of these models and other models of the lineup.
All the major car makers are trying to compete in the EV market. Where do you think the EV market is heading? And I wonder, can car production, battery production and charging station infrastructure keep up?
Well, it obviously very much depends the countries and the regions of the world. What you can see in Europe is the train has now started. We can see a very steady growth of the EV market. We are aiming, as you well know, to go to 100% EV by 2030. North America also started. In other parts of the world, it's a bit slower. But what we can observe in India, particularly, we started to sell an electric model 3 months ago, and we have great expectations in this market, on the electric segment, because the usage of the car is very much urban and suburban, and that's absolutely perfect for electric vehicles. So we think it will take up at different pace in the different regions of the world, but everywhere we will see electric vehicles growing.
Every car boss I've interviewed on this program in the last 2 years has talked about the crisis of semiconductor production and chip wars. What's the impact been on Citroën?
Well, actually, like all the brands of Stellantis, we had to face the semiconductor crisis in 2022 that prevented us from manufacturing and selling all the cars we wanted. We can see already in the first semester of 2023 an improvement. We think that there will be further improvement in the second semester, aiming to have most of the crisis behind us by the end of the year.
There'll be no small talk from the driver as a fleet of driverless robo-taxis takes to the suburbs of Beijing. Our correspondent Wang Tianyu jumped in for a ride in the backseat.
In the outskirts of Beijing, there are over 200 robotaxis running in an area of 60 square kilometers. And every day, these vehicles help people to finish the first and last miles of their daily commutes. So how do these driverless cars operate in the public roads? I'm gonna find out myself. It's actually not the first time that I tried out autonomous driving vehicles, but each time I stepped into the car, the first thing I saw was always a safety driver on the wheel. But not like this time. The only human beings inside this car are just me and my cameraman. I still couldn't believe there's really no man sitting there, but the wheel and the cars are just moving by themselves. Compared with the last time I took the self-driving car, the first take from today's experience is the car is faster and more flexible in navigation. I mean, the car is not like a rookie driver like it used to be like anymore. So turning, parking, and even switching lanes are smooth and spontaneous. That's all because the robotaxi uses level 4 autonomous driving technology. According to the standards made by the US engineering standards group SAE International, L4 autonomous driving means the vehicle could drive itself under certain conditions. It's only one step away from the highest level 5 of fully autonomous driving. In China, there are over 5,600 companies in the self-driving related sector. They focus on developing the L4, but mostly for public use, like in a theme park, airport, and campus. Short distance, point to point.
Wang Tianyu reporting from Beijing. Now, it's the company behind some of China's favourite tipples, and Baiju's stock market debut was supposed to be the toast of the town. Instead, it ended up leaving some investors with a rather nasty hangover. Our correspondent Li Juanhua has been watching this drama unfold. Tell us all.
Yes, Jamie, and Hong Kong's biggest public listing of 2023 flopped on its trading debut on Thursday. And shares in Shenzhou Lidu, one of the largest privately owned makers of Baiju, a fiery spirits popular in China, ended 18% lower on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Shares were priced at $1.37 at open, slightly lower than its IPO price, but dropped to $1.13 by the close of the trade. So investors had high hopes for the company, backed by US investment firm KKR. The Baiju maker hoped to raise around over $670 million, but it only managed to rake in about, here we go, $570 million. And the company planned to spend around half the net proceeds from the IPO expanding production facilities over the next 5 years and another 20% promoting its brand. Now the company may be having second thoughts. So, what are the reasons for the Baijiu maker's epic failure on the first day of trading? Earlier, I talked to Hong Hao, chief economist at Grow Investment Group.
Well, I think the failure of Hong Kong, being one of the most popular fundraising center in the world this year was because, Hong Kong has a really bad stock market last year. Right? So I think, for people who's trying to raise money, they want to have a better multiple so that they can raise more, for the same company. So I think, ever since the rebound since last October, I think Hong Kong market has been, steadily, slowly giving up, some of the gains, since last October. So if you want to sell your company at this difficult market, it would mean that you will have to sell it at a lower multiple that you would want to. And therefore, you would not be raised as much money as you want to, given the normal situation. I think that is the reason why people are not coming back to the Hong Kong market right now to raise money because, valuation multiple is compressed.
And do you think that will dash investors' confidence at this moment, and what will happen next?
I don't think it's a investor confidence. I mean, this is general market condition that, people just don't want to buy into new issues that hasn't been proven just yet. All right, so I think, given time, as the market heal in Hong Kong, then, valuation multiple would, recover and come back. And, as a result, people would warm up to this part of the world and start selling shares. But I think right now it's a general market condition. It's a beta issue rather than an alpha issue.
So, Jinhua, how bad is this for Hong Kong's IPO market?
It's actually very bad. It's not positive. People have high hopes for this company. It's the largest IPO in Hong Kong Stock Exchange this year. But now it's busted. I mean, the hope is busted. So for the company, Zhenjiu Lidu is not really popular in China, to be honest. Not many people know about it. And though it's the fourth largest privately owned Baijiu maker, it's the 14th largest if we add all of the state-owned Baijiu makers in China. If we look at its net profits, in 2020 it was $75 million, and then in 2021 it jumped to $150 million, the same for 2022. So also, very interestingly, that it spent around $230 million on advertising over the past 3 years, so a lot of money on branding. So apparently it has a very bad impact on Hong Kong's IPO market. We know that Hong Kong, one of the world's largest financial hubs, and then it is seeking to reclaim its status as the place for fundraising, but apparently another epic failure. So if you look at the IPO market for Hong Kong in the first quarter of 2023, not promising. It hosted 18 IPOs, raising $840 million. But if we look at the same period last year, in 2022, it was 15 IPOs, 3 fewer, but more money, raising about $1.7 billion. So it is not doing really well, apparently. And what are the reasons? You can always blame it on COVID.
Or the advertisers, that's the other possibility. Blame them.
Jinhua, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Li Jinhua. Well, the next G7 meeting in Japan in May looks set to be contentious. China has accused the United States of violating international trade rules as it tries to dominate the microchip and semiconductor markets.
The United States has levelled similar accusations at China. Now President Biden is reportedly getting an executive order ready to try and cut off Beijing's access to the most advanced equipment. Our correspondent Owen Fairclough reports.
It's official. Micron is coming to central New York.
The US computer memory and storage company, the latest manufacturer to bring some production back home, with a new factory announced for New York State. With 50,000 jobs and up to $100 billion of investment, helped by government incentives aimed at reinvigorating American computer chip production.
Artificial intelligence.
But Micron technology is now on the front lines of a deepening trade battle between the US and China.
In order to safeguard its own hegemonic self-interests, the United States has forcefully pushed for decoupling, and it does not hesitate to coerce its allies to cooperate in containing China, which seriously violates market economic principles and international economic and trade rules.
Beijing reacting to reports that Washington is pressing South Korea not to fill any supply chain gaps should China ban Micron following a national security review of its products. Washington's overtures to Seoul are considered part of a strategy to limit China's access to the most advanced chips and semiconductors, and it follows bipartisan moves by US lawmakers to ban or at least restrict the hugely popular Chinese-owned social media app TikTok, amid claims denied by Beijing that it's being used for spying. The US has already persuaded Japan and the Netherlands to stop selling China critical equipment for making microchips and semiconductors to power next-generation technology. According to US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, given the foundational nature of certain technologies, such as advanced logic and memory chips, we must maintain as large of a lead as possible. But the US Chamber of Commerce is warning that American companies risk becoming the collateral in this escalating struggle for technological supremacy. Owen Fairclough, CGTN, Washington.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the bare necessities. Welcome home, Yaya. We'll meet the people who've travelled long distances to greet the Chinese panda.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Authors, artists and Chinese chefs showing off their culinary prowess are all part of an exhibition celebrating China-France relations in Paris this week. It coincides with the 60th anniversary of diplomatic relations.
A 12-day cultural event is the first since the pandemic. Our correspondent Nathalie Marras reports.
From delicate art to literature, visitors are offered a glimpse of an ancient Chinese world. The contemporary artistry reflects a more modern touch. For art lovers and unlikely fans alike, it's a balance of technique and tradition.
Events like this Paris Fair gather an extremely large public and an extremely diverse audience, people who would not necessarily be interested in the cultural exchanges in their daily life. So it is a good occasion to open up and invite a very broad population to these cultural and artistic exchanges.
It's an example of a commitment to deepening ties between China and France.
I feel all sectors and industries are recovering. We are confident that there will be more cultural exchange platforms and opportunities. That way we can understand each other better and learn from one another.
China exports to France predominantly include electronics, construction machinery, manufacturing appliances and household goods. President Macron's visit to China earlier this month was seen as a diplomatic success by both Paris and Beijing. And exhibitors here are optimistic that that could lead to more cultural and creative collaborations across various industries. It's the first time since the COVID pandemic that the expo is being held in Paris to ignite an appetite for potential future ventures.
The two presidents set a very good example for our two civilizations to learn more from each other. For example, President Macron learned a lot about ancient Chinese music when he visited China. I think their meeting will facilitate further developments and mutual learning between the two countries, especially for our younger generation who will learn more from each other. For Chinese people, what we learn from history, no matter China or France, both of us benefit if we learn from each other and exchange our culture and views on other topics.
Visitors will be able to take in the sights and sounds of Chinese culture at the exhibition for the next week. Natalie Malchas, CGTN, Paris.
Thousands of indigenous Brazilians are protesting in the capital, Brasilia, as part of a 5-day annual event known as the Free Land Encampment. They want new reserves to be created on their ancestral land. Native leaders from over 300 indigenous groups are attending the march.
Severe drought has left 80,000 people without water in Spain. A reservoir in Cordoba, a major water source for the area, has dried out for the first time in 40 years. Residents have had to rely on trucks to deliver clean water. The region has seen only 2 days of rain this year. Spain has had 36 consecutive months of below-average rainfall.
Turkey's President Erdogan has cancelled another day of engagements because of ill health. He's now taken part in a virtual ceremony alongside Russia's President Putin, inaugurating Turkey's first nuclear power plant. The $20 billion plant was built by the Russian state nuclear company Rostom. Putin described it as the largest nuclear construction project in the world.
Long time ago. That is South Korea's President Yoon Suk-yeol singing American Pie while he attended a state dinner at the White House. President Biden asked Yoon to sing one of his favourite songs. While in the United States, Yoon and Biden agreed a landmark deal to counter the nuclear threat from the DPRK. The two held talks over semiconductor chips, trade and the Ukraine war.
Portuguese speakers have a new word to describe unique and incomparable, and it is Pelé. A nickname used by the Brazilian footballing legend was included in the Michaelis Dictionary following a campaign by the Pelé Foundation. Pelé, the only player to have won the World Cup 3 times and considered the best footballer in the history of the game, died in December at the age of 82.
Yaya, the giant panda, has arrived back home in Shanghai after spending 20 years at Memphis Zoo in the United States. Our correspondent Chen Yilin reports.
Behind me is Shanghai Pudong International Airport. So Yaya, the giant panda, has just landed in Shanghai after a nearly 16 hours flight. So since this morning, many Chinese netizens have been following her trip back home. And according to the flight map, it is a FedEx flight, and many have noticed that the flight map has a panda icon. So during the whole trip, Yaya was accompanied by both the Chinese and American vets. And many Chinese panda lovers already went to the airport to wait for her return.
I took an 8-hour train from Xiamen to Shanghai to see Yaya. I hope Yaya can be taken good care of after returning to homeland.
I couldn't help bursting into tears when I saw Yaya come back. We want all the pandas to be safe and healthy.
Yaya has become a bridge of friendship between Chinese and foreign people. We hope these pandas who are in foreign countries can be healthy and happy. We hope to see them more often.
This is the Shanghai Zoo, and right over there is the Panda House. So Yaya is expected to spend around a month under quarantine in Shanghai before being housed at Beijing Zoo. Chen Ling, CGTN, Shanghai.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.